Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in this video, I'm very excited to show you what's new in Oxygen 4.0. And just because I don't want to ruin the surprise, let's go ahead and load into our sample page using Oxygen. We'll go ahead and click Edit with Oxygen, and like that, you now see one of the new big changes, which is a new loading screen. We're no longer going to see that loading cogwheel that all of us love so much, and instead we see a much more interesting loading animation and a loading progress bar. And now that we're in Oxygen, you can see that our whole Builder UI has gotten a bit of a facelift. This includes some slightly major changes, but your Oxygen workflow should not be severely interrupted by any of the changes we made. In fact, some things are even easier to get to. For instance, if you look up at the top bar, you're going to see that our breakpoints are immediately accessible without having to select an element first. And we still have the familiar buttons on the top right side of the top bar, but we've exposed style sheets and selectors directly, so you no longer have to nest down into a submenu to access those. And of course, we have the back to WordPress and save buttons, the add button, and then we've moved the hide and show sidebar button down just next to the properties pane. And if we just go ahead and click through some of these menus, you'll see everything looks pretty familiar, but it all looks a little bit more modern, a little bit cleaner, and just overall slightly improved over the old UI. We've also switched our UI colors to neutral grays because sometimes when you're designing a website and trying to determine which colors to use, having a colored UI or a saturated UI can actually interfere a bit, so we thought the neutral grays would be a welcome change. We've also made quite a few quality of life improvements. For example, if we go over here to selectors, and let's add a couple of selectors. Let's add a body selector, let's add an H1 selector, and let's add a paragraph selector. And then let's say we want to find these later on, we can just type in the search bar up here, and it's going to filter the selectors out for us. So this will make sites with a large number of selectors much more manageable. And to show you some of the other improvements, let's go ahead and add a few elements here. Let's add a section, and you can see the add pane looks quite a bit different. You can see a few more elements at a time than you could previously, which is nice. Let's add a section in, and then let's add a heading. Now on this heading, let's go ahead and adjust the text color here. Now if we hop down to another breakpoint, we're going to see that text color inherited from the larger breakpoint. And if we change it here to something like black, we then see that inherited value too, until we get up to here where it's inheriting the value from the all devices settings, which is super nice. It works with all the fields here. So if we do something like 32 pixels for the font size and then step down, we can see that 32 pixel value. So let's go back up here and let's clear all the styles from this selector, and let's add a class. We'll call this heading. Now, if we do something like font size, 32 pixels, you can see we have a little indicator to the left-hand side of the input. This is green. It matches the color of the class badge. That's because this is telling us that this property is getting its style from a class. And if we hover over it, we can see that explicitly stated. The cool part is, even if we're on the ID and we haven't set a value on the ID, we can see over here that this property has a value from the class. So it immediately would let us know that we need to jump over to a class to change that if we want to keep using the class. If we, however, want to set the value on an ID, we can go ahead and do that. And the indicator immediately changes to let you know that it's styled via an ID because the ID always overrides the class. This is incredibly helpful if you have something like a design set where you have some values set via an ID, but you have classes selected by default when you load into the builder. You can see at a glance that changing this value won't actually do anything if you change it on the class. You're going to have to actually go over to the ID. So these little indicators are present for all the fields. Some of them do look a little bit different. So if we go to layout, for example, some of these button list controls have this little underline that then expands out. And then of course we have our size and spacing, which also looks quite a bit different. When we set values here, we get the indicator, but not the hover effect because these fields are kind of small and it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And so you can see here, we've also done some rearranging of some of our controls. Our margin and padding control looks a lot more like what you'd expect in a modern website builder, and the control positions correspond to the property that they are manipulating. Now let's delete this element and let's go ahead and build something here. Let's do a columns 50-50. Let's add a heading. Let's add some text. And on the right-hand side, let's just add a placeholder image. Now let's style this heading a bit. Let's give it this color and then maybe some margin below it. So we'll do like 32 pixels of margin. Let's just drop in some lipsum. So now we have an element that's somewhat styled, and we may want to reuse this somewhere. So we have added a few keyboard shortcuts to Oxygen. If we hit Command or Control S, we save. If we hit Command or Control D, we duplicate the currently selected element. Command or Control Backspace or Delete deletes the element. And of course, we have the Command or Control Z and Command or Control Y shortcuts for undo and redo, which have been in Oxygen for a while. One of the newer shortcuts that's quite exciting is copy and paste. So if we select this columns element, we'll hit Command or Control C, and it gets copied to the clipboard. Now we can select the section or any other section. For instance, we can add a section here and then Command or Control V, and it's going to drop in what we copied. Now, the really cool part about this is if we jump back into the WordPress admin panel, and let's go all the way back to our pages list, let's add a new page called sample page 2. Let's publish it, and then let's edit that in Oxygen. Now you remember we copied that columns element from our first sample page, but let's assume we want to use it here. If we hit Command or Control V, we can now paste that element into Oxygen. So these elements are copied into the clipboard in a way that allows you to copy and paste across Oxygen designs on the same site. This, of course, was possible using reusable parts before, but now it's just a couple of keystrokes and you're copying and pasting elements around your Oxygen site very, very easily. One other minor tweak that was actually really highly requested is the ability to double-click the name of an element up here at the top of the properties pane and rename it. This does save quite a bit of time, so you no longer have to go over to structure and find the element and click the pencil and click rename and do all that. So it does save a bit of time. A couple other highlights: modals will now animate out using the same animation they animate in with. And when it comes to design sets, you can now upload custom screenshots for design set pages, blocks, and individual sections. We've also done some behind the scenes work. We've corrected an issue with the repeater element where the repeater would cause there to be duplicate IDs on the front end, which is generally a bad thing. So we have actually corrected that, which does require that you go ahead and regenerate your CSS cache after upgrading to Oxygen 4.0. because the way the repeater elements are styled has changed a little bit. But if you go ahead and regenerate your CSS cache, all your styling will be in place and you don't have to make any changes on the back end. But you will no longer have duplicate IDs in your repeaters. We also upgraded Oxygen to the latest supported version of AngularJS, and we implemented PHP 8.0 support. And for the final big change, we've changed the way Oxygen stores its designs from using shortcodes, which is the WordPress native way to do it, to using actual JSON, which is a different data format that's much quicker to work with. So if we jump back to the admin, you'll see we now have a shortcodes field and a JSON field. On sites with existing designs, you'll have data in your shortcodes field, but this is just for backwards compatibility. Those shortcodes will no longer be used to render the site. The JSON will be used instead. And the reason this is much quicker is because before we were having to take the shortcodes, convert them to JSON to use within Oxygen, and then convert them back to shortcodes. So we've cut out kind of an intermediary process there that kind of speeds things up a little bit. It also eliminates some of the problems folks had with having many Oxygen add-ons, because the number of shortcodes that were registered for each new Oxygen element could get quite excessive if you had multiple add-ons that added elements. With the shift to JSON from shortcode, that should no longer be a problem. Now that's pretty much it for what's new in Oxygen 4.0 Alpha 1, but now let's talk about Oxygen WooCommerce 2.0 Alpha 1, which is coming out alongside 4.0 Alpha 1. We've added a couple of new WooCommerce elements. I'm going to show you one of them here real quick. So I've dropped in a section and I'm going to go to WooCommerce and I'm going to look for the mini cart element. Let's drop in the mini cart element and you can see we immediately get this kind of fly out cart effect. We can adjust the styles. We can also set it to always show the preview in the builder so that it's a little easier to design the cart. Let's go ahead and hide that. And then under summary, we can turn on or off the price quantity. So we can have just the icon with a little quantity badge. And then we also have some other styling adjustments. For the flyout itself, we have a full width option for when we're on mobile devices. Sometimes it might be nice to have it just expand to the full width of the viewport. We have the background color, which we can adjust to, I don't know, something like white. And you can see there that it adjusts for us. We also have link typography and other typography, as well as where the flyout is actually going to be in relation to the summary. So it can be off to the right, it can be off to the left, or it can be right in the center. We also have a width setting, which is at 300 pixels by default, and then some padding, so we can increase the padding in there to get a little more space. So that's a quick rundown of that element. We've also added some WooCommerce specific conditions, so let's jump into the conditions menu and take a look at those. We can add a condition, and we'll find a new category of conditions called WooCo. We can check whether a customer has bought a product, whether the customer has a specific product in the cart, whether the customer is on a shop page, on a WooCommerce page in general, on a product page, on a cart page, on the checkout page, account page, or if the customer is on an endpoint. Endpoints are used a lot for things like thank you pages and order confirmation, so this makes it possible to display specific things for specific endpoints, which will be super helpful for gaining full control over the design of your WooCommerce site. And speaking of gaining full control, we've also added code in Oxygen which allows you to override WooCommerce templates by adding them to a specific path, which is in wp-content/oxywoocotemplates/WooCommerce. So if you're used to overriding WooCommerce templates using a child theme, this approach is now available to you with Oxygen without having to install any additional plugins. We've also made several tweaks and bug fixes to the WooCommerce add-on, and you can find a full changelog of those in the alpha release blog post. So that about wraps up the changes in Oxygen 4.0 Alpha 1 and Oxygen WooCommerce 2.0 Alpha 1. If you're an existing Oxygen user and you're interested in testing these versions, head over to oxygenbuilder.com/portal and download the alpha today. Just a reminder, do not run this alpha on a live or production environment because there are still a lot of tweaks that need to be made between now and the final release. But if you do test the alphas, please let us know via GitHub if there are any changes you'd like to see or any bugs you encounter so we can get those taken care of. Again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and thank you very much for watching.